the link to our listserv and on social media outlets so that people can watch this offline. So thank you for bearing with us as we move through this. And if you could advance the next slide.
Okay.
Alrighty, and please leave your audio muted, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. So hold your questions if you would, please. And if you do have a burning question, you can put it in the chat, and we'll monitor the chat and answer the questions at the end. And as I said, we plan to post the recording. Okay, so this webinar is sponsored by HERA. HERA is the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance. And I'm Christine Wiseman, and I am the co-chair and one of the founding members of HERA. We are an Atlanta-based volunteer organization dedicated to helping cultural heritage organizations prepare for and recover from emergencies. Since our founding in 2007, as part of the National Alliance for Response seminars, HERA has expanded, and we have members from around the state of Georgia and beyond. Our members include conservators, librarians, archivists, curators, registrars from museums, historic preservationists, emergency responders, and managers. We have a steering committee that meets quarterly, and we have annual or more frequent training programs such as this. This program we're hosting in honor of May Day. So we hope that many of you will join HERA. All you need to do is go to our website. You can see the link on the screen. Membership is free. We welcome new members and participants. We have an online form. Once you complete that form, you'll be added to our listserv and our database. And please follow us on Facebook. So not to waste any more time, I want to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Anne Frellsen has recently retired after nearly 27 years as the book and paper conservator for Emory University. Anne teaches workshops on a variety of topics, including preservation of collections, disaster planning, emergency response, and book arts. Currently, Anne volunteers at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking and is a member of the Southeast Regional Conservation Association, the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance, and the American Institute for Conservation. Recently, Anne made 2 trips to Puerto Rico to assist with recovery of cultural heritage collections damaged by hurricanes Irma and Maria. And that's what she is going to talk about today. Thank you, Anne, and take it away.
Thank you, Christine and Christine Garrett and Richard for helping to solve all the technical difficulties. And thank you to all my friends and colleagues out there for hanging in there. So I wanted to tell you about my 2 recent trips to Puerto Rico. I went in November and again in January as a member of the National Heritage Responders. I led 2 teams. Each was a week-long trip to the island, and we visited institutions and collections that were damaged by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. We did assessment. We provided advice and help, sometimes even a little bit of actual hands-on work to the staff. And then all the while, we were collecting information that will be used for later recovery efforts. Our reports, written reports, are going to be used by FEMA. They have a cultural entity now within their group, a cultural heritage entity led by Lori Foley. And because of that, they were very interested in meeting with us and hearing about our work and getting our final report. So we're very excited that what we do will actually go towards helping these institutions that we visited recover eventually. A little background about NHR. It's a group of about 100 conservators and other library and museum professionals from around the country. We all have specific training in the specialized needs of cultural institutions that are in emergency situations, and also for later recovering from the disasters. In addition to our individual specialties, mine is book and paper, for instance, our training also includes health and safety protocols, and how to work with first responders. So that means that we learn the incident command system, and you'll see that we sort of work within that realm while we are on the ground. We also work with state agencies, disaster recovery vendors, and obviously the public. There is a hotline, which I think I forgot to put on the list. I can certainly forward it to people later, but you can also go to the American Institute for Conservation and Cleanup Emergencies. And we so through the hotline, after the hurricanes, we started getting information about institutions, and we started the process of trying to figure out how we were going to get there. So what you see pictured is myself at retirement. I'm pretty happy. And then again with my second team, Bob Herskovitz from Minnesota and Susan Duell from formerly Pennsylvania, in Puerto Rico. And that's normally what we look like. So I thought I'd put a picture up of myself so you know what I really look like. We did have to wear that gear almost every single day for at least a couple hours, if not several hours every day, because we go into sites to document the damage, and the damage is considerable, as you will see. Most of these institutions, by the time we got there, had had no power for 100 days. Mm-hmm. So many of the institutions we visited were located in the historic district of Old San Juan. Mm-hmm. As is typical of 16th and 17th century construction, the streets were narrow, mostly single lane, absolutely solid with cars, people trying to get about. Most of the streets were blocked or had become one-way at that moment. They're paved with blue cobblestone, so and the walls are dense, several inches thick, and so quite beautiful. So that interconnectedness of the buildings somewhat protected them from the storm's damaging winds, but of course the buildings have been modified to add power. Can you see my cursor? So behind this little turret right here are dozens of wires and satellite dishes and things like that. And all of that was wiped out. And then windows and doors have their original heavy wooden frames, but so they either blew completely out or the glass broke. And then that rain continued for 2 solid weeks after the final hurricane. Oh, sorry. So there was obviously complete loss of many buildings, particularly along the edges of the historic district. So they're up on the cliffs, and they took the full brunt of the storm. Most of the island's population suffered from flooding, whether it was from the rain or from flooding rivers and creeks and culverts and streets, as well as an absolute lack of resources. Obviously, compounding the problems quickly over time because of the slow relief process. Total losses from the hurricane are estimated at $92 billion. Most of that is in Puerto Rico alone. A bit about, this is actually not a real bird, but a painted bird on a curb. It's a beautiful city. So in order to get around, we're fortunate to have 2 amazing coordinators for the NHR, as well as this 100-member contingent of expert help who make our travel arrangements. They set up the site visits and appointments. They do research to support us while we're on the ground. It's pretty much all the team can do to make sure we remember to fill our backpacks each day with a fresh supply of PPE, personal protective equipment, like headlamps, many pairs of nitrile gloves, Tyvek suits and booties, respirators with HEPA filters, hard hats, hair covering bandanas, because you don't want the mold in your hair for the rest of the day, snacks, individually wrapped, and tons of water that we carry, which is actually quite heavy, but you need it because the days are always very hot. The other thing that really occupied us was trying to figure out how to get around when, in fact, most of the power grid was still not working. The stoplights and road signs were usually completely missing, so you didn't even know that there had been a stop sign there because you couldn't see the damage. It was just gone. And roads were also blocked by debris, emergency vehicles, convoys of repair trucks, etc. We had spotty cell service at best, and most of the map apps that we were trying to use hadn't been updated with road closures. So needless to say, we rarely made it to any destination without several missed exits or having to U-turn in the middle of a large intersection with 10 other vehicles doing the same thing, but all going different directions. Exciting. That was exciting was a phrase we used often. Similar to pre-storm actions that members of HERA undertake to inform cultural heritage organizations that are in harm's way of an upcoming major threat, the AIC and NHR folk always send out information, as we did to Puerto Rican entities, with steps to prepare for and then how to contact us after the storms, particularly if they incurred damages. In the days following Irma, which struck first, we didn't hear very much. But a few days after Maria, Hurricane Maria, once communications were minimally established at best, we already began to hear from libraries, historic houses, museums, etc., about the damage that they were faced with. And these are a couple examples of the photos that they sent us. Not too bad, right? So I want just a point of reference. I want you to remember that Irma struck on September 6th as a Category 5 hurricane, and Maria hit exactly 2 weeks later as a high-end Category 4 hurricane on September 20th. So due to the catastrophic damage to the island's infrastructure, as well as major impacts to most of Florida, a large portion of Georgia, including Atlanta, as well as in Texas, emergency response flowed pretty much to a snail's pace. I think FEMA was overwhelmed by the needs and demands in so many different places. And so it was a week, the last week of November, we left just after Thanksgiving before we could safely get to Puerto Rico. So that was my first trip. And these are images of the same spaces by the time we got there. So you can see the difference. So we're pretty lucky. We have equipment and we're labeled. Oh, I should also mention that the National Heritage Responders was just granted NOVAD status, so national organizations that volunteer in disasters, I think, after disasters. And so that also gives us a credibility when we go into these institutions. But we do have gear, so we look fairly official. This is us walking down sidewalk towards the University of Humacao Library. And you can see that, I don't know if anybody in the audience was in Louisiana or Mississippi after Katrina, but you can see the typical damage where the trees were mostly stripped. And Humacao, for what it's worth, was in the center of the island and very high up, so near the rainforest, so pretty devastated. So our first step is always to gather information. We are usually trying to meet before we go into the situation, trying to gather information from the local staff, collection managers, building managers, etc., sometimes the president of the university, in order to get as much information ahead of time, because it's difficult to record type information while you're on site. So that's Susan Duell and I with the director and the head of collections at the Humacao Library. This is us at the Universidad de Plastic Arts. We were actually, this is an open air tower in the top of their building, and there was a lovely breeze coming up, so that's where we conducted our interview here. The people that we met had been going, obviously, for a long time with very little. As all of us are aware, our collections are our babies, and we're as worried about them as we are about our own lives and families. The language problem was also a bit of an issue. This is an image of somebody who worked in the gift store beneath this museum and came up, and the woman, the older woman, was trying to tell her about the damage, and then they were trying to tell us in English what she was saying. But you can see from just her demeanor that she's just exhausted, as were most people. And yet they were in their institutions with no electricity, no water, no conditioned air, doing the best that they could all day long, every day. Not to say that health and safety is secondary, but it's not. It's certainly right at the top. And I really feel like we cannot go into institutions unless we are protected. Otherwise, we can't do our work efficiently. But we can't also ask the local people to go in with us unless they're fully protected. So we spend a lot of time training people to put respirators on correctly, make sure they actually zip up their Tyvek suit. Yes, I know it's hot, but you have to wear it, please, at least in my presence. We spend a lot of time convincing them that they need to take care of themselves and describing the harmful effects of being in the odd, unknown material that is on the floor and in the air. It's not just mold, and it's certainly not just mold on the mud on the ground. We took a large box every day with us in the trunk of the car, and it was filled with nitrile gloves in all different sizes that we could pass out to people. We brought the emergency response wheel and books that were both in English and versions in Spanish. We brought drop cloths to drape materials that were not contaminated, maybe protect them, and also to replace where other materials needed to be removed, and we could put them on the tarp and then drag them out. Ziploc bags for collections, hand sanitizer we distributed to all sorts of people, and all of this was in addition to our own hand tools and our own PPE. I spent a lot of time training people to put their masks on, making sure that they knew how to do them. It's kind of funny when you're, talking to a 6-foot large man and you're telling him, no, you have to do it my way. And then we go in, and obviously most of the institutions didn't have power, so you're going down dark steps. That's why the headlamp is so valuable. So you have your hands free to hold on to stair rails and hold open doors and et cetera. And you never know what you're going to find. These were actual collection items in the stairwell for some reason. I never did actually get the story behind that. But they were valuable materials, and the man had forgotten that they were there, so it was a good thing. So again, this is an institution where it didn't look too bad, but it turned out that the collection manager, which is this fellow behind Susan, had been in the space, and he'd done some cleanup before we got there. Of course, we did still find a lot of problems. This is kind of typical. This is damage from rain coming in through the ceiling, drenching the records boxes. They were, the door that you see is where they were going to be removed and taken to another location so that they could be used. but they got, but then the storms happened and they all got wet. You know, sometimes it just takes your breath away when you see the damage. This is well over my head height on the green wall, and just everywhere. This is Toa Baja municipality. It's their city archives. My colleague Bob Herskovitz, the mold is over his shoulders, and he's probably 5'10". So you have to keep your focus and remember to pull out your phone and document and document and document. Sometimes we walked into institutions and it looked pretty good. And so this one actually had power. This is University of Puerto Rico, Bayamon Central Library. And they were already in the process of cleaning. But we are trained to look beyond that, so it looks pretty good. Guys painting, they've scraped the ceiling a little bit. But this is what I see almost immediately. This was about the mold on the walls was about 20 feet from that fella. So he'd scraped the vertical support, but not in the nook. And then the carpet had all sorts of odd things growing. I'm also, I guess I'm a little pessimistic about rapid cleaning efforts. And so if I noticed that the molding, the floor molding had gaps, like you can see right here, I just pulled it off because obviously they hadn't done it, and of course it reveals all this mold behind it. And so they weren't doing a very thorough job. And so one of the things that we had to do was make sure that we pointed out where these cleaning companies who were, in air quotes, restoring them back to normal needed to be more thorough and less efficient. So it was going to look pretty, but there was going to be a lot of problems that were going to emerge later. If you can see Susan's expression, we couldn't figure out why the dehumidifier wasn't on, and then we realized that the hose was clogged, completely clogged. So they weren't doing very typical maintenance stuff that they should have been doing, you know, several times a day, is checking all of that, and they just, obviously, it didn't look like they'd ever cleaned it. Again, just some sights of some of the spaces that we walked into. We're all the time, you know, walking with the owners, and so because it's their spaces, they know intimately, and they can point out where we might not have looked necessarily. This is Raphael at Casa del Libro Museum of Books, and he's telling us where a historic leak is. And of course, you can see on the right image that, you know, 100 days later, it's not just mold, it's growing green stuff and pink stuff, and there's even some purple stuff. It's part of our training to recognize old damage from new damage. Not that that matters necessarily, but you don't want to confuse the issues, particularly when you're reporting to FEMA. So obviously new damage on the left with wet carpeting. This bucket was absolutely, this trash can was full of kind of slimy green-brown water, which they had obviously put underneath a leak and then never emptied, and then the trash can leaked. And then on the right, they were in the process of stripping the walls. And so what you're actually seeing is not that the plaster has flaked off, but they scraped it off in a gallery space in order to paint, but then the hurricane struck. And so there is a little more mold growing along the top than there was previously, but it's not as dramatic in this particular space as it looks. So we're walking around, and obviously we're looking sort of most of the time down and watching our feet, and at collections, and we see this, and we couldn't figure out what this was until that was all over this desk, until we looked up, and this is what we saw. So I think one of the problems in Puerto Rico is that their infrastructure, their government has been broken for quite a long time, and so there's been a lot of deferred maintenance. And that then compounded the problems that the hurricanes brought. So obviously their HVAC system had a lot of problems, but the fact that the vent, this is all that remains of the vent that was up there. So it completely disintegrated and, rusted out and disintegrated and then fell. Just an indication of then the magnitude of the work that they're going to have to do to recover in this particular building. We're always looking up, as I said, and when we see things like this ceiling vent on the left, that's pretty suspicious looking, and so then we ask to go to the mechanics room or the machine room, whether it's in the basement or on the roof or tucked several places where they don't normally expect us to go. And then this is what we find on the inside when we pulled off the screen to the front of the HVAC, is filters that obviously stopped when the hurricanes arrived. So this was pre-dirty like this. And so obviously they were not doing what they should have been doing. So you can't blame everything on the hurricanes, but you certainly know that this then was compounded. And what you actually can't see, I couldn't get a good picture of it, is that the mold that's growing on the dirt on the filter on the right is easily 3/4 of an inch deep. So again, we were very interested in what the cleaning companies were doing. They certainly looked busy. There were several of them in the building, but about 5 feet away from that fella was this sitting on a desk. So he'd obviously pulled it out of the ceiling, but he wasn't cleaning it, and he didn't think he had to. We corrected that. People up on ladders, and he's cleaning a ceiling, and he's got this jug, and again, there's paint down here on the floor, but what is he using? And so we asked, and we see the microban, and so then would send an image back, and we would get our team to then research what the ingredients were and was that okay. And in this particular case, it was suitable. They had a cleaning crew who was cleaning the books. This is what we found, how they were cleaning the books. And so then we were very interested in pulling the materials out where they had already cleaned. And needless to say, we needed to do a little more work. And we never could figure out what was in the spray bottle. And again, we couldn't convey our question well enough, and certainly not understand the answer. So yes, we looked at a lot of books. Obviously, paper and books are most vulnerable after 100 days of no power and high humidity. This collection pretty much we called a total loss. We hate to do that, but in reality, there's no way that this collection could really be recovered. We had to kind of, third book from the left, I pulled a piece of tape off of the spine in order to try to see what the spine said. That's why there's a little missing area. We also got some very adamant calls, oh, you have to come, we've got so much problems, and then we'd show up and it would be like this. And that goes back to the stress and the emotional trauma that the people are feeling. They really didn't have much of a problem. They had isolated most of their damaged books. We wandered around, and of course we were able to find mold. It's what we're trained to do, but there just wasn't that much of it. So we were able to, I think, relieve some people that their problems were, um, you know, they were, yes, they were problems, but in the big picture, it was pretty insignificant, and that they were doing a really good job at what they needed to be doing. Again, this is, you know, pulling out a book and then opening it, and this is what we would find. And it just meant that they, you know, we trained them while we were standing in their library about how to go through and look and see what it is they needed to do. We looked at a lot of other collections. We looked at audiovisual. These are films, audio tapes, cassette tapes. In the white boxes on the lower shelves are thousands of carousels, or hundreds of carousels, thousands of slides. Films, you can see the film cans are very rusty. And in fact, in this particular library, the cleaning crew had finished, in quotes, and yet you can see the mold growing in the top right corner on the wall. They had pulled out boxes for me to look at, and then when I looked up, I could see the mold. So they didn't do a very thorough job. Again, they were just being efficient and cursory. We saw some very cool things. This is not this Puerto Rican flag is nails and threads on black velvet, and you can see a detail on the right of the, I thought this was framing when I looked at it from a distance, but it's in fact, it's threads. And if you look closely, you can begin to see the mold growing on the black velvet, which you don't see. They thought this room was fine. And then as we got closer, it was absolutely covered with mold. We saw some life-size ceramic sculptures, fabulous masks from all over the Caribbean and the area. Indeed, a shrunken head. That's Molly Carlson on the right with the director of this museum. Not one of their prized possessions, but certainly one that the public loved to see. And we actually, they had put him in the sun to help dry him out a little bit. He seemed to be doing pretty well. And of course, we found things like this. So the native frog is called a coqui. It's about 3/4 of an inch long, and this poor little guy got in, but then couldn't get out. Sometimes it's hard to know when you have a respirator on, but we could smell something, and we traced it back to a staff refrigerator. And you can just see on the bottom of the refrigerator that it is slimy black, that mold, and it smelled terrible. We did training. That's Hitoshi Kimura in the background there with the respirator on, and myself training people to separate still damp artists' exhibition catalogs. This was the main collection that they were concerned about, and there were thousands of them. And so we sat them down, outfitted them, and then trained them how to separate them, and then left them some hand tools, microspatulas, and lifters. Again, what are they using to clean? It was always interesting to look in. You can see Windex and then this chem material in addition to the microban. Interestingly enough, you can see the respirators are in there. They're still in their bags. They're not on their heads. I spent a lot of time trying to train people, cleaners, people who were vendors in proper techniques, and using my Mexican Spanish, which is not the same as Puerto Rican Spanish, to try to express the importance of protecting themselves when they're in these spaces. This was compact that
enseñándole a las compañías que están limpiando los libros en Puerto Rico cómo protegerse, porque no estaban poniéndose ni mascarillas para limpiar las colecciones.
Okay.
La compañía que está
Again,
haciendo limpieza aquí para
um,
nosotros.
so this
Otra
was
compañía, cleaning something.
compact shelving
Sin
that they have
protección,
been
limpiando
hoping
libros
to use,
sin mascarilla ni nada.
but it was a powder coated finish, but
Sí,
the water had sat on it because it had also come through the
usa
plaster of the ceilings and the walls. It was very corrosive by the time it landed on the compact shelving, and then of course it sat there. So it had eaten through the powder coating. So they're going to have to put some kind of finish or layer between materials and using the shelves if they're going to use it again, which was quite disappointing to that institution. Oftentimes the public records are very important, and we had to. This actually was in the Toa Baja municipality archive, and they were pulling these out and taking them to where the staff had been relocated. And so we thought we better check them and make sure that they weren't putting those other people at risk by the amount of mold that was in this building. And we did pretty much tell them that they had to be very careful because we did find a good bit of mold on these things. Again, just documenting everything. This was this fellow's desk, and he went regularly to this, not dressed as we encouraged him to be dressed, as he is in this picture. And that was his chair. And the only reason the seat looks as clean as it does, and not like the arms, is because he'd been sitting in it at least weekly. Pretty impressive collections that they have to evacuate and figure out what they're going to do with. Major work ahead of them. I pretty much convinced them that this building is a total loss, the building itself, and that they have to get these collections out, isolated, vacuumed, and then rehoused. And they have no money, so who knows? Again, this is at the Agricultural Experiment Station outside the library there, and this had been a very dense, beautiful garden, and everything was just on the ground. You can see that historically they had a little problem. Interestingly enough, this library was underground with this big glassed-in atrium that was in the center of it, and they had rats in the atrium. So I'm assuming that they didn't think it was unusual that they were in the collection. We did find a lot of evidence of rats being very happy in the archive, in the library. Just me documenting that. Here's that evidence. Feces, and this is the water level, so that's easily 8 inches above the ground level. So the water filled in that glassed-in atrium, and then who knows how it drained out. Probably through the rat holes. So having an iPad or a tablet was very useful, except that it's a little bit hard to type on it when you're walking around. So I found myself many times having to walk out, sit down, type up what he had just told me, and then go back in. It was about 80 degrees temperature-wise outside, and probably 100 to 120 degrees inside the Tyvek suits. Again, at Casa del Libro, they had protected their collections very well. What you can't see is on the other side of these stacks where the wooden framed windows broke the latch and blew in. So I think that our written reports are going to be very useful to FEMA and to future recovery efforts. We're already talking, the NHR is talking about sending more teams. The Smithsonian Institution has a directive to do as much education as possible amongst the cultural heritage institutions as they can. They've already done several workshops. Other institutions like Princeton and University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign have sent some of their staff down to help people, particularly those who were Puerto Rican by descent. On a positive note, there were some just amazing things. This book, the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, was his personal copy of his first book, and literally gave me goosebumps from the top of my head to my toes. Just fabulous, fabulous collections. And who knew that this was in Puerto Rico? And just a final note, again, it's a beautiful city. The people are warm, incredibly warm and incredibly generous, and very grateful for every little thing that we've done and are hoping to do more. Several of us are going back at different times on our own. And I just wanted to part with a couple of shots of the beauty of Puerto Rico. That's the blue cobblestone that the historic district is paved in. And, graffiti art, which I felt like was very positive. I think for as much as these people have been through, and you all know what they're feeling and going through, and then add that, 15% of the population, I think, still don't have power, and are still going to work every day. And it's just amazing, their resilience. And I know that you all can totally relate to them rebuilding, and in a proud way. So thank you. I guess I'm going to switch this off and switch it over to Todd Lampkin, who's going to lead the question and answers. And thank you.
Thanks, Ann. Well, so I've been monitoring the chat window, but have yet to receive any questions. So I guess I will cautiously suggest that if you do have any questions for Ann, feel free to unmute yourself and take turns as best as you can. If we find that's not working, then we'll go back to the chat window and I'll ping Ann with those questions. Thanks.
Hi, Todd. It's Tina.
Hey, Tina.
Hey, I just was wondering if Ann could clarify that about the micro ban and how it was considered okay, but
they weren't,
not for cleaning collections.
Yeah, right. They were not using it on collections. They were only using it on the walls. The young women that I was talking to who had been cleaning the books kept trying to assure me that they weren't using the microban, although we did hear about it being used in other collections elsewhere. It's controversial, but at a certain point, I think a lot of times it had been done, and while it wasn't something that we recommended, we certainly weren't going to criticize them for having done something if it was too late to do anything about it.
Thanks, Ann.
Yep.
Apologies, I had muted myself. Let's go back to the chat window. So we have a few questions here. We'll go in order. So the first question we have here from Genevieve, how were supplies brought in? Did NHR or FEMA arrange this?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, the good question. So NHR, we each brought 3 pieces of luggage. And so I'll just tell you that when you do that and you're on a humanitarian mission, it depends on the airline whether or not they'll charge you for that 3rd piece of luggage. A particular airline here in Atlanta charged me $185 for that 3rd piece of luggage. Other JetBlue, I think, and Southwest both waived those fees for us because we just explained that they were supplies. So the suitcases were filled with the respirators. We did a major Amazon purchase everything got shipped to me and my teammates, and then we loaded them into our suitcases. If we were overweight, sometimes the airlines would let us slide a little bit, but we did a lot of repacking at the check-in lines to try to redistribute materials. FEMA was not able to bring in supplies. They were overwhelmed with bringing in all of their normal things, and shipping at the time, particularly in November, was extremely slow because the port wasn't fully open yet. And it wasn't until the January trip that the port of Puerto Rico was open enough to allow the first cruise ship to come in on our last day there. So that was mid-January. So FEMA had offered to try to help us with containers, but it was going to be months before they could get our supplies in. And in fact, the Smithsonian team, we stayed in an Airbnb because all of the hotels were booked by FEMA. The Smithsonian team ended up staying on an Italian military ship because they had come to help. I guess they were not too far away when the hurricane struck, and they were one of the first ships to come in. And they had some room for the Smithsonian folks. So pretty much all of the volunteers brought their own materials in. Although I will say that across the street from our B&B, our Airbnb, was a Walgreens and a CVS. And we watched, over the 2 times that we were there, we watched pallets of things like Clorox, Bounty paper towels, and isopropanol, containers of isopropanol come in.
Okay, well, so we had a question, how did you know where to go, I think, meaning how was it decided which sites you all would respond to?
So that was up to the coordinators, and we tried to group them so that we would be in the same vicinity each day for as many as we could fit in. The first trip, the first week, I think we saw 17 different collections, which was in fact too much for us. Once people found out that we were on the island, they started communicating with their friends and their colleagues, and then I would get phone calls asking, and I would refer them back to Rebecca Elder, our NHR coordinator, and then she would negotiate whether or not we could get to them. So pretty much it was a first come, first serve, and if you were close to where we were going to be and we had time in a day, we would try to get there. The second trip, we had less sites, and we were able to spend more time at each of the sites, which was actually better for all involved. We were overexhausted after the first trip.
And we had a question about the shots you had of the rolled collections. Do you know what those documents were?
They were building property, land plats, as well as blueprints for the civic buildings in that province, so in district. So they were all sorts of things that they were still pulling out to refer to as they were trying to do renovation in the buildings in the area.
And then we had a question, were there recovery companies on the island that had expertise working with collections?
That's a touchy question. There were many vendors on the island. Whether or not they had actual expertise was questionable. We stopped several and asked who they were and what, where we could find out information about their company. We did it in a nice way. We didn't want them to think we were a negative. And then we would send the information back to Rebecca or the team back here in the States, and they would do a little research and see if they could find out anything about them. Balfour was on the island, absolutely overwhelmed.
Yeah. then we've had a couple of questions just recently from Genevieve about what was done to assess damage to digital collections, and with all of the damage to the infrastructure, has there been any study about were digital assets lost as a result?
Not that I'm aware of. Most of the institutions our first visit didn't have power, so they didn't have computers. There was very little internet up and running, so nobody really knew about that. I will say that at the Toa Baja Archive, they were in the process of doing, well, actually at several of the institutions, they were in the process of digitizing materials. And they were encouraged that this situation might get them more money to be able to speed up the process later.
Oh, and then, sorry, Olivia. Yeah, we had a question here that some of the shots showed folks pulling rolling suitcases behind them, whereas others, they had backpacks. Is there a reason why folks preferred the rolling bags?
They're actually backpacks with wheels. And so one thing you need to know is that you cannot carry on two-wheeled items on most airlines. You can check one of them, but you can't carry on two-wheeled items. We didn't know that, of course. Our backpacks have wheels, and when we're going up and down stairs, we just put them on our backs. They're very useful. I think I would recommend them. I think Jess Unger at AIC, she's our coordinator through AIC, and she can provide information about where those backpacks came from. They're pretty awesome. They've got lots of pockets, so you can keep your water bottle separated from your snacks, separated from all of your PPE, and your writing utensils and your tablet and stuff go in another pocket. So they're pretty fabulous. I like the flexibility of that. We did actually, I have a very old rolly suitcase. It's very minimal, and we did use that for hauling that box of supplies around. Often we had to park several blocks away from where our institution was that we were visiting, or where several of the institutions were, so we would just park the car and then we would have to walk the streets. So not having a lot of weight on your back when you're going up and down hills and over ground that's not even is very helpful.
And we've had requests, if Jessica is still on, I saw we had her earlier, if she could share a link to where you get the backpacks. I think people would appreciate that.
Oh, good.
Thank you. I just saw her chime in. All right. We had a private question come in to Christine about researchers interested in doing research in Puerto Rican archives. Are these even still accessible, or do they exist at this point? And how would someone go about getting those questions answered?
So the University of Puerto Rico system has several campuses, and I think we visited 5 on our 2 trips. Most of the campuses have a Puerto Rican collection that's specific for their region or their focus. And then there are, of course, Puerto Rican archival collections all across. We even went to the legislative library. So it is the library for the legislation of the legislators of the island, and they had a Puerto Rican collection, so materials about the governance. So it would depend on what somebody was interested exactly in doing. If you have a focus, I would send, most of the websites are back up. Most of the people have their email back up at most of the institutions, and then they can help guide you towards which collections in particular. It's a lot. I highly encourage you going. The more public is there, the more money they are receiving, and then the faster they'll recover. It also gives them their administrators' impetus to put funding towards the libraries and archives, which, as we all know, are very often at the bottom of the list of priorities. They would rather, for instance, at the Humacao campus, they had classes up and running, but the library, they didn't even go in and pick up put tarps on the roof, so the rain was still coming in, and they didn't bother to go in and clean up the floors or any of the rain that had come through, so the materials just rotted. So there's a disconnect in the importance of what we know to be very important, the cultural heritage collection, and often the administration of institutions. So go for it. Yes, they're all over the place, and they're mostly intact.
We had a previous question about grant resources. Are there any special grant resources that have been opened up to Puerto Rican institutions as a result of the disasters? And if so, is the word getting out?
Yes. So in the beginning, there was emergency response CAP grants, conservation assessment, preservation assessment grants that people applied for, and AIC very generously redirected a bunch of money to make more of those grants available, and so many of the institutions, who were aware of them. The problem was if you didn't have internet, you might not know. If you didn't have a good collegial connection, you might not know. But the word was definitely getting out. I think that there are not nearly enough grants for people, and they're not nearly sufficient. They might work for the collections as well. That certainly is our focus. But most of these institutions really need to have buildings repaired, or they need to be moved into new buildings, and there aren't those available. So, or they're too expensive, or the institution has no money to do such a thing, to either repair or to move. So it's a problem. Oh, thank you, Jess, for the backpack supplier. I love them. Any other questions?
Last call for questions.
I did see a comment earlier about the fact that if they weren't cleaning thoroughly, the mold is always going to come back, and that is certainly true. And it's why I went around and pulled off baseboard, just to expose the fact that they were not being thorough, and a lot of times they were just painting over the damage or the mold, and that wasn't going to be good enough.
We have one last question here. Is there a way, I'm not sure if Rebecca's asking, is there a way that institutions within Puerto Rico are partnering with one another, or is she saying, is there a way that institutions in Georgia can partner? Okay, got it. So are institutions partnering with one another to move collections while they make repairs?
Yeah, so I think that's what Princeton went down to assess, a particular collection that had a Princeton connection, and they were trying to decide whether or not they could bring it to the U.S. and do the treatment in their conservation lab. I think those are the kinds of things that, it's up to the institution to have developed a relationship or to reach out to those of us who know more about the institutions, or reach directly to the institution if you have an interest, particularly if it's something that is specifically tied to your organization, then it's easier to sell that to your administration. I think there's a lot of ways that can be done. I don't think there is a protocol necessarily for how that happens, and I couldn't tell you, a organized process even. It's kind of ad hoc right now, as far as I know.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. We really appreciate it. To me, at least, it was fascinating. I just wanted to remind everyone that, and yes, the thanks are coming in if you're not checking the chat window, Anne. We will post a recording of the presentation soon. Look out for it as a reminder on the HERA listserv and on social media. And we thank you all for joining us. Any last thoughts?
I just want to say thank you for putting up with the technical problems, and thank you to Richard for fixing everything for us, and Christine Garrett. Appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
I guess that means we'll just end it now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it.